Hey guys, tonight we travel back many centuries into the quiet countryside of the Middle Ages. Our story tonight is called A Day in the Life of a Medieval Shepherd. Before we begin, I noticed that many of you enjoy listening to these videos at night, but most of you are not subscribed yet. So if you enjoy relaxing history stories like this, consider subscribing. Your support really helps this small channel grow. And before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to comment below and tell me which city you are listening from. I always love seeing where in the world people are falling asleep to these stories. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's slowly step into the peaceful hills and quiet fields of medieval Europe. Our journey begins early in the morning, long before the sun has fully risen. The morning in a medieval village began long before the sun appeared above the hills. In a small wooden hut near the edge of the village, a shepherd slowly opened his eyes. The air was cold and the faint smell of smoke from last night's fire still hung in the room. Outside, the world was silent. No carts were moving. No merchants were shouting in the marketplace. Even the birds had not yet begun their morning songs. The shepherd stretched slowly beneath his rough wool blanket. Life in the Middle Ages rarely allowed anyone to sleep late, especially not a shepherd. His work depended on the rising sun, the movement of animals, and the changing rhythm of the seasons. Carefully he sat up and placed his feet onto the cold wooden floor. For a moment he simply listened. Far away he could hear the faint sound of sheep shifting inside their enclosure. A quiet rustling of wool and hooves. They were waking too. The shepherd rubbed his eyes and reached for his thick cloak hanging beside the bed. The cloak was made from coarse wool, heavy but warm. It had protected him from rain, wind, and cold nights many times before. After pulling the cloak over his shoulders, he stepped outside into the pale morning light. The sky was just beginning to change from deep blue to soft grey. A thin mist lay across the fields surrounding the village, and beyond those fields stretched wide, rolling hills covered in grass. This was where the sheep would spend most of their day. But first, they needed to be gathered. Near the hut stood a wooden fence built from rough branches and logs. Inside the enclosure waited the shepherd's flock. Dozens of sheep stood quietly together, their thick wool forming a soft white mass in the dim light. Some lifted their heads as the shepherd approached. Others continued chewing slowly, still half asleep. Beside the fence lay the shepherd's most loyal companion, a sheepdog. The dog lifted its head immediately when it saw the shepherd. Its ears perked up and its tail began to wag gently. Unlike the sheep, the dog was always ready to begin the day. The shepherd smiled faintly and scratched the dog behind the ears. Together they had watched over the flock for many seasons. The shepherd opened the wooden gate slowly. The sheep shifted and murmured softly as the cool morning air reached them. But they did not rush out. Sheep rarely hurried unless frightened. Instead, they waited for the familiar signals from the shepherd and his dog. The dog stood and walked calmly to the side of the flock. It knew exactly where to position itself. Years of training had taught it how to guide the animals without scaring them. The shepherd picked up his wooden staff from beside the fence. The staff was simple but important. It helped him walk long distances, climb hills, and gently guide stubborn sheep back toward the group. Now the village itself was beginning to wake. A thin trail of smoke rose from a distant chimney. Somewhere, a rooster crowed loudly. A farmer's cart creaked slowly along the dirt road. But the shepherd and his flock were already leaving the village behind. The dog moved gracefully along the side of the flock. The sheep began to walk forward, one after another, following the narrow path that led toward the hills. This routine repeated itself almost every day of the shepherd's life. Morning after morning, season after season. The path curved gently upward away from the village fields. Soon the huts and farms disappeared behind a small rise in the land. Ahead lay the open countryside, wide green hills stretching beneath the slowly brightening sky. This was where the sheep would graze, and where the shepherd would spend the long, quiet hours of his day. The sun finally began to rise above the distant hills. Golden light spread slowly across the grass. Dew sparkled on every blade like tiny drops of glass. The sheep spread out across the hillside, lowering their heads to begin grazing. Soft, tearing sounds filled the air as they pulled mouthfuls of grass from the earth. The shepherd leaned on his staff and watched them calmly. There was no rush now. For the next several hours his task was simple: stay nearby, watch carefully, and protect the flock. The dog settled down on the grass beside him. Its sharp eyes continued scanning the hills. Even during peaceful mornings, danger could appear without warning. Wolves sometimes wandered near these hills, and thieves occasionally looked for easy animals to steal. But today, the countryside seemed calm. The wind moved gently across the grass. Birds began singing in the trees, and the warm sunlight slowly pushed away the cold morning air. The shepherd breathed deeply and looked across the wide, quiet landscape. For many people in the Middle Ages, life in crowded towns could be noisy and stressful. But here on the hills, the world felt slower, simpler, and strangely peaceful. The sheep continued grazing without concern. The dog rested beside the shepherd, and the long day of watching over the flock had only just begun. The sun continued to rise slowly over the gentle hills. Its warm light stretched across the fields like a soft golden blanket. The shepherd stood quietly for a moment, watching the flock spread across the hillside. Dozens of sheep moved slowly through the grass, their heads lowered as they grazed peacefully. From a distance, the flock looked like a drifting white cloud resting on the green slopes. The morning air was still cool, but the first warmth of the sun could already be felt on the shepherd's face. He shifted his weight and leaned comfortably on his wooden staff. This quiet part of the day was often his favourite. There were no urgent tasks, no loud voices or crowded streets, just the slow rhythm of nature. Beside him, the sheepdog lifted its head and looked across the hills. The dog's sharp eyes were always searching. Even when resting, it was never truly asleep. The shepherd bent down and gently scratched the dog behind its ears. "Easy morning today," he murmured softly. The dog wagged its tail slightly as if it understood every word. A faint breeze moved through the tall grass. The blades swayed slowly, making a soft whispering sound that carried across the hillside. Some of the sheep wandered farther away, exploring patches of thicker grass. The shepherd watched carefully. Sheep were gentle animals, but they were not always clever. If one wandered too far, others might follow, and soon the flock could become scattered across the entire valley. That was when the sheepdog would quietly step in. With calm movements and careful steps, the dog guided the sheep back together whenever they drifted too far apart. It never barked unless absolutely necessary. Most of the time, its presence alone was enough to keep the flock moving in the right direction. The shepherd slowly walked a short distance up the hill. From the higher ground, he could see much farther across the countryside. This view helped him watch for danger. To the east, the hills rolled gently toward a distant forest. The dark trees formed a thick wall along the horizon. That forest was beautiful, but it also held many secrets. Wolves sometimes travelled along its edges, especially during colder seasons when food became scarce. The shepherd knew those forests well. Over the years he had learned to recognise every trail, every rocky slope and every quiet valley nearby. He also knew which areas the sheep should avoid. Some slopes were too steep, some valleys flooded after heavy rain, and some places were simply too close to the forests where predators might hide. For now, though, the sheep grazed calmly in the open field. The morning was peaceful. A group of birds suddenly flew across the sky overhead. Their wings flashed in the sunlight as they travelled toward the river valley in the distance. The shepherd watched them disappear beyond the hills. Birds often moved in great flocks during certain seasons. Their migrations were another quiet reminder of how the natural world moved in slow and predictable cycles. The sheepdog suddenly stood up, its ears lifted high. The shepherd noticed the movement immediately. "Easy," he said quietly. He followed the dog's gaze toward a far ridge across the valley. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a pair of deer stepped cautiously from behind a group of bushes. The animals paused, looking around carefully before continuing their slow walk across the hillside. The dog relaxed again and sat back down. Deer were no threat to the flock. They simply shared the same wide countryside. The shepherd smiled faintly. Moments like these reminded him how many creatures lived quietly in these hills. Not every visitor brought danger. Some simply passed through, living their own peaceful lives. The shepherd continued walking slowly along the slope. His boots pressed softly into the damp earth as he moved. Every so often, he gently tapped his staff against the ground. The familiar sound reassured the sheep that their guardian was nearby. A few curious lambs wandered closer to him. They sniffed at the grass around his feet before returning to the safety of the flock. Young lambs were always the most curious. They explored everything, sometimes too much. The shepherd kept a careful eye on them. Their small size made them especially vulnerable if danger appeared. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The mist that had covered the valley earlier in the morning slowly faded away. Now the entire countryside stretched clearly in every direction. Fields, hills, distant farms, and winding dirt roads all became visible in the bright daylight. Somewhere far away, the faint sound of a farmer's cart echoed across the land. Wooden wheels creaked slowly along a village road. But here on the hills, the world still felt quiet and calm. The sheep continued grazing patiently. They rarely hurried through their meals. Instead, they moved slowly from one patch of grass to the next, chewing thoughtfully as they walked. The shepherd eventually found a flat stone and sat down. From here, he could watch almost the entire flock. He reached into a small leather pouch hanging from his belt. Inside was a simple morning meal, a small piece of bread, and a slice of cheese wrapped in cloth. It was not a large meal, but it was enough to keep him satisfied during the long hours outdoors. He took a slow bite and looked across the valley once more. The sheepdog lay beside him, resting its head on its paws. For a while, neither of them moved. The countryside seemed perfectly still. Only the quiet sounds of grazing sheep filled the air. Soft, tearing grass. Gentle hooves stepping through the field. Occasionally a sheep would let out a low bleating call. The others answered softly, as if reminding each other they were still together. The shepherd finished his bread and brushed a few crumbs from his cloak. The day was still young. Many hours remained before the sheep would return to the village. But these peaceful moments in the morning were often the most relaxing part of the shepherd's work. The hills were quiet, the animals were calm, and the entire world seemed to move at a slow, comfortable pace. For now, the shepherd simply watched over his flock beneath the brightening sky. And the long day in the life of a medieval shepherd continued gently forward. By the time the sun climbed higher into the sky, the hills had changed completely. The cool mist of the early morning was gone. Warm sunlight now covered the entire valley, stretching across the fields and hillsides like a soft golden blanket. The sheep had slowly moved farther across the grassy slope while grazing. Without rushing, they wandered wherever the grass appeared thickest and freshest. The shepherd stood once again and slowly walked along the edge of the flock. His wooden staff tapped gently against the ground with each step. It was not a loud sound, but the sheep recognized it immediately. The quiet rhythm of the staff reminded them that their guardian was nearby. The sheepdog followed a few steps behind him, moving carefully along the outer edge of the flock. From time to time, the dog gently shifted its path to guide a wandering sheep back toward the others. It never needed to bark loudly. Its calm presence alone was usually enough. The shepherd paused at the top of a small rise in the land. From there, he could see the entire hillside below. The flock looked peaceful as it spread slowly across the green grass. Dozens of white woolly backs moved quietly through the field. The gentle sound of grazing filled the warm air. By now, the shepherd knew it was nearly midday. This was the time when both the shepherd and the animals slowed their pace. The sun was warm. The grass had already been eaten in many places, and the sheep were beginning to grow a little tired from the morning's grazing. The shepherd scanned the hillside and spotted a small group of trees near a shallow stream. The trees cast wide patches of shade across the ground. It was a perfect place to rest for a short while. He lifted his staff and gently signalled the sheepdog. The dog stood immediately, understanding the silent command. Together they began guiding the flock slowly toward the shaded area. The sheep moved willingly. They had learned this routine over many seasons. Soon the entire flock drifted toward the trees like a slow-moving cloud. The stream beside the trees flowed quietly over smooth stones. Clear water sparkled in the sunlight as it moved along its winding path. The sheep eagerly stepped forward to drink. Some lowered their heads directly into the shallow water. Others waited patiently behind them. The shepherd sat beneath one of the trees and removed his leather pouch again. This time he took out another small piece of bread and a bit of dried meat. Medieval shepherds often carried very simple meals. Food had to be easy to carry and able to last many hours in the open air. He took a slow bite and leaned back against the rough bark of the tree. Above him, leaves moved gently in the soft breeze. Sunlight filtered through the branches, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the ground. The sheepdog lay nearby, resting its head on its paws. Even while resting, its eyes occasionally opened to watch the flock. The sheep themselves had grown quiet. Many were lying down in the grass, chewing slowly as they rested after the long morning of grazing. This quiet chewing was called cud chewing. Sheep would bring back the grass they had eaten earlier and chew it again slowly. It was their way of fully digesting their food. The shepherd smiled faintly as he watched them. To someone unfamiliar with sheep, the animals might seem dull or sleepy, but the shepherd knew they simply lived at their own slow and steady pace. Life on the hills followed the rhythm of nature. Nothing hurried, nothing rushed forward. The wind blew gently across the valley. The stream continued its soft, endless flow. Even the clouds above moved slowly across the bright blue sky. Far away, the faint shape of another shepherd could be seen on a distant hillside. His own flock grazed peacefully on the opposite slope. The two shepherds were too far apart to speak, but they lifted their staffs briefly in greeting. It was a silent acknowledgement between two workers sharing the same quiet world. The shepherd finished his meal and wiped his hands on his cloak. He leaned back against the tree and closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but simply to rest while listening to the peaceful sounds of the countryside. A bird chirped softly from somewhere in the branches above. The sheep shifted quietly in the grass. The stream murmured beside the trees. Moments like these were rare for most people in the Middle Ages. Village workers were often busy with tools, markets, and crowded streets, but shepherds spent long hours surrounded by open land and quiet nature. It could sometimes feel lonely, but it could also feel incredibly peaceful. After a short while, the shepherd opened his eyes again. The sun had moved slightly across the sky. The shadows beneath the trees had shifted. Soon it would be time for the flock to begin moving again. The sheep would need fresh patches of grass before the day ended. The shepherd slowly stood and stretched his arms. The sheepdog noticed immediately and rose to its feet. It shook its fur once and looked toward the flock. The rest break was nearly over. Soon the quiet hills would once again fill with the slow movement of grazing sheep, and the long, peaceful day of the medieval shepherd would continue beneath the wide open sky. The quiet rest beneath the trees slowly came to an end. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, and its warm light now stretched across the entire valley. The shadows beneath the trees had grown shorter. The sheep were beginning to stir again. Some slowly stood and shook the dust from their thick wool. Others continued chewing calmly, finishing the last of their midday rest. The shepherd gently pushed himself up from the base of the tree. He stretched his arms and looked across the flock. The sheepdog noticed the movement immediately. Its ears lifted, and it rose to its feet with quiet readiness. Both of them knew the routine well. It was time to move again. The shepherd stepped forward and tapped his wooden staff lightly against the ground. The familiar sound echoed softly across the shaded clearing. Several sheep lifted their heads. A few lambs trotted a short distance before settling back beside the flock. The dog began circling the outer edge of the sheep, guiding them slowly away from the trees. There was no hurry. Sheep never moved quickly unless frightened. Instead, the flock slowly gathered itself and began walking toward the open hills once more. The shepherd walked behind them at a steady pace. The afternoon air felt warmer now. The gentle breeze carried the smell of fresh grass and distant wildflowers. Above, white clouds drifted lazily across the bright blue sky. The path they followed curved gently upward across the hillside. This part of the land held thick patches of grass that had not yet been eaten. The shepherd knew these hills well. He had walked them hundreds of times before. Every slope, every stone, every small stream hidden among the tall grass. As the flock climbed the hill, the countryside opened up again in front of them. Far below, the small medieval village could be seen resting quietly in the valley. Thin trails of smoke rose slowly from the chimneys of the houses. Farmers were now working in their fields. From this distance, they looked like tiny moving shapes among the crops. The shepherd paused for a moment and looked down at the village. For many people, life in the village was busy and noisy. Markets, workshops, and crowded streets filled the day with constant activity. But here on the hills, everything felt different, slower, quieter, more peaceful. The sheep spread out again across the grassy slope and began grazing. The dog moved carefully along the edges of the flock. Every now and then it gently nudged a wandering sheep back toward the group. The shepherd leaned on his staff and walked slowly along the ridge of the hill. From here he could watch the entire valley. The stream from earlier wound its way through the fields below like a thin silver ribbon. A group of birds circled high above the hills. Their wings glimmered briefly in the sunlight before they disappeared into the distance. The afternoon passed quietly. The sheep grazed patiently, moving slowly from one patch of grass to another. The shepherd occasionally whistled softly to the dog. The dog would shift its position without needing any further command. Years of working together had made them almost perfectly synchronized. The shepherd suddenly noticed a small lamb wandering too far down the hillside. It had followed a particularly green patch of grass away from the others. He lifted his staff slightly and gave a quiet whistle. The dog reacted instantly. With smooth and careful steps it ran down the slope. It did not bark, it did not chase. Instead it gently circled behind the lamb and slowly guided it back toward the flock. Within moments, the little lamb had returned safely to the group. The shepherd smiled faintly. The dog had done exactly what it had been trained to do. Work like this required patience. Shepherds could not force sheep to behave. They had to guide them calmly and carefully. The sun began moving slowly toward the western hills. The warm afternoon light softened into deeper shades of gold. Long shadows stretched across the grassy slopes. The sheep continued grazing, unaware that the day was slowly coming to an end. For them, the hill simply provided food and space to wander. But the shepherd knew the rhythm of the day very well. Soon it would be time to gather the flock and guide them back toward the village. The sheep would spend the night safely inside their enclosure. The shepherd and his loyal dog would finally rest after the long hours of watching the hills. But that time had not yet arrived. For now the afternoon remained peaceful. The breeze moved gently through the tall grass. The sheep grazed calmly beneath the golden sky. And the shepherd continued his quiet watch over the flock, standing patiently on the hillside as the slow medieval day moved steadily toward evening. The afternoon sun hung calmly in the sky, casting a warm golden light across the rolling hills. The shepherd stood quietly on the slope, leaning on his wooden staff as he watched the flock below. The sheep continued their slow and steady grazing. From a distance the field looked alive with soft white shapes moving gently through the tall grass. The sound of the countryside was peaceful and simple, the quiet tearing of grass, the soft rustle of wind through the hills, and every now and then the low bleating call of a sheep searching for the comfort of the flock. The shepherd slowly walked along the ridge of the hill, his boots pressed softly into the warm earth beneath him. Every few steps he paused and looked carefully across the land. A shepherd's job was not only to guide the sheep, it was also to watch the world around them. Danger could appear from many places. Sometimes it was a wandering wolf from the distant forests. Other times it could be thieves hoping to steal a sheep under the cover of night. But today the hills were calm. Nothing moved except the flock and the gentle breeze. The sheepdog trotted quietly beside the shepherd. Its eyes moved constantly from one side of the hillside to the other. Even when the day seemed peaceful, the dog remained alert. The shepherd whistled softly. The dog immediately shifted its path and moved toward the edge of the flock. Several sheep had slowly drifted farther down the slope while grazing. The dog walked calmly behind them, guiding them back toward the center of the group. The sheep trusted the dog. They had seen it many times before. Instead of running away, they simply turned and followed the direction it guided them. Soon the small group rejoined the rest of the flock. The shepherd nodded with quiet approval. The two of them worked together almost without speaking. The shepherd continued walking along the hillside until he reached a large stone that rested near the edge of the ridge. He sat down carefully and rested his staff beside him. From this spot he could see nearly the entire valley below. Fields stretched out in wide patches of green and brown. A distant road wound its way between farms and villages. Occasionally a small cart could be seen moving slowly along the dusty path. The shepherd watched the road for a while. Travellers passed through the countryside almost every day. Merchants carrying goods to distant markets, farmers delivering grain or vegetables, messengers riding between castles and towns. Each traveller had their own story and destination. But the shepherd rarely left these hills. His life followed the quiet routine of the flock, day after day, season after season. Still, he did not mind. The hills offered something that busy roads and crowded towns could not. Peace, a calm and steady rhythm of life. The sheepdog wandered a short distance away and lay down in the grass. From there, it could still watch the entire flock. The sheep themselves continued grazing peacefully. A group of lambs began playing near the centre of the field. They hopped clumsily across the grass, bumping into one another as they ran. The shepherd chuckled softly. Young lambs were always full of energy. Their playful movements stood in sharp contrast to the calm behaviour of the older sheep. The warm afternoon air carried the scent of wildflowers growing along the hills. Bright yellow and purple blossoms dotted the grassy slopes. Bees moved lazily from flower to flower. A butterfly drifted quietly through the air before disappearing among the tall grass. The countryside felt alive, yet wonderfully calm. The shepherd closed his eyes for a brief moment and listened to the sounds around him. There were no loud voices, no ringing bells, no crowded streets, just the simple music of nature, the wind, the animals, and the distant call of birds high above the hills. After a short rest, the shepherd stood once more. The sun had moved slightly lower in the sky. The shadows on the hills were beginning to stretch longer. The day was slowly beginning its quiet journey toward evening. The sheep continued grazing, unaware that the peaceful afternoon would soon give way to the cooler hours of sunset. The shepherd picked up his staff again and began walking slowly across the hillside. The dog rose and followed immediately. Together they continued their calm watch over the flock. The long and gentle afternoon on the medieval hills carried on beneath the warm and fading sunlight. The afternoon slowly moved forward across the hills. The sun had begun its gentle journey toward the western horizon. Its bright light softened into warmer shades of gold and amber. Across the countryside, long shadows stretched slowly over the grassy slopes. The sheep continued grazing peacefully. But their movements had become slower now. After many hours of feeding, the animals were growing calm and satisfied. Some sheep lowered themselves onto the grass and rested while chewing slowly. Others continued wandering in small groups across the hillside. The shepherd walked quietly along the ridge, his wooden staff tapping softly against the earth with each step. Beside him, the sheepdog moved with steady focus. The dog's sharp eyes still watched the flock carefully. Even when the day seemed quiet, a shepherd could never fully relax. The countryside was wide and open. Many things could happen on the hills: a sudden storm, a wandering predator, or even a curious traveller passing too close to the flock. The shepherd paused and looked toward the distant forest once again. The dark line of trees remained still beneath the warm afternoon sky. No movement could be seen along the forest edge. The hills remained peaceful. The shepherd took a slow breath of the cool air and continued walking. Below him, the sheep moved gradually toward a lower part of the hillside where the grass still grew thick and fresh. The dog noticed immediately. It gently shifted its position and guided the animals in the same direction. The flock moved together like a slow-flowing river of wool across the green fields. The shepherd often marvelled at how naturally the sheep followed this rhythm. They did not rush or hurry. They simply moved wherever the land offered food and comfort. The wind moved softly across the valley. It carried the distant scent of farms and fresh earth from the village below. Somewhere far away a bell rang faintly, perhaps from a small chapel in the village square. The sound travelled gently through the open air before fading into silence. The shepherd looked down toward the valley. The village appeared peaceful from this distance. Small houses stood close together along narrow dirt roads. Thin trails of smoke rose slowly from chimneys as evening meals were prepared. Farmers would soon begin finishing their work in the fields. Merchants would close their stalls in the market. Children would return home before darkness settled across the land. But the shepherd and his flock still had a little time left on the hills. The sun had not yet reached the horizon. The sheepdog suddenly lifted its head. Its ears twitched as it listened carefully. The shepherd followed the dog's gaze toward a nearby ridge. For a moment the hillside remained still. Then a small group of wild rabbits hopped quickly through the grass before disappearing into a cluster of bushes. The dog relaxed again. The shepherd smiled faintly. Not every sudden movement meant danger. The hills were home to many small creatures living their quiet lives. As the afternoon slowly faded, the light across the countryside grew softer. Golden sunlight spread gently across the fields. The sheep continued grazing peacefully beneath the warm glow of the setting sun. The shepherd walked slowly down the slope toward the flock. Soon it would be time to gather the animals and guide them back toward the village. But for now, the quiet rhythm of the hills continued. The wind whispered through the grass. The sheep moved calmly through the field, and the medieval shepherd watched patiently over his flock as the day slowly prepared to welcome the evening. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western hills. Its light now stretched across the valley in long golden rays. The bright blue sky of the afternoon was slowly changing into softer shades of orange and pale pink. Across the hillside the sheep continued grazing quietly, but their movements had grown slower. Many of them had already eaten their fill for the day. Some stood peacefully in the grass. Others rested while chewing slowly. The shepherd knew that evening was approaching. Soon the flock would need to begin the journey back toward the village. Night in the countryside could be cold and uncertain. Sheep were safest when gathered together inside their wooden enclosure near the huts. The shepherd stepped down the slope toward the centre of the flock. His wooden staff pressed gently into the grass with every step. The sheepdog followed closely beside him, watching the flock carefully. The shepherd raised the staff slightly and gave a quiet whistle. The dog immediately understood. It began moving along the far side of the flock, guiding the animals slowly closer together. Sheep rarely moved quickly unless frightened. Instead, they gathered slowly, one after another, forming the familiar group that the shepherd guided every evening. The flock began drifting toward the narrow path that led down the hillside. The sheep moved calmly along the trail, their hooves making soft sounds against the earth. The shepherd walked behind them, keeping a steady watch over the group. The dog moved along the edges, ensuring no sheep wandered away from the path. From the top of the hill, the entire valley could now be seen glowing in the warm colours of sunset. Fields and farms stretched across the land below. The village rested quietly in the centre of the valley. Thin trails of smoke still rose from the chimneys as families prepared their evening meals. The shepherd paused briefly and looked across the peaceful scene. For many villagers, the end of the day meant returning home from the fields or workshops. But for the shepherd, the final task of the day was just beginning. The flock continued walking slowly down the slope. A few curious lambs trotted ahead before stopping to wait for the others. The sheepdog gently circled behind them and guided them back into the group. The shepherd smiled softly. The dog knew its work well. As the flock reached the lower fields, the grass became shorter and the land more open. This area lay closer to the farms that surrounded the village. Farmers sometimes waved to the shepherd as he passed by with the flock. Today, one farmer stood near his field, leaning on a wooden fence. He lifted a hand in greeting. The shepherd raised his staff in return. No words were spoken, but both men understood the quiet rhythm of the countryside. The sheep continued moving along the familiar path toward the village. Their soft, bleating sounds drifted gently through the evening air. The sky above had now turned deeper shades of orange and purple. Birds flew across the horizon, returning to their nests as night approached. The wind had grown cooler. The shepherd pulled his wool cloak slightly tighter around his shoulders. The long day on the hills was slowly coming to an end, but the quiet beauty of the countryside remained. Golden light touched the rooftops of the distant village. The flock moved steadily along the winding path, and the shepherd continued his calm watch as the peaceful medieval evening slowly settled across the land. The evening light stretched softly across the valley as the shepherd guided his flock down the gentle hillside. The sun was now much lower in the sky. Its warm glow painted the countryside in deep shades of gold and amber. The long shadows of the sheep moved slowly across the grass as they followed the narrow dirt path. From a distance, the flock looked like a drifting river of white wool flowing toward the village. The shepherd walked calmly behind them, his wooden staff resting lightly in his hands. Each step he took was slow and steady. After many years on these hills, his body knew the path almost without thinking. Beside him, the sheepdog moved quietly along the outer edge of the flock. The dog's eyes remained alert, scanning the fields and hills that surrounded them. Even though the day had been peaceful, the dog never forgot its duty. A shepherd's work did not end until every sheep was safely returned home. The path curved gently downward toward the valley. The air had grown cooler now that the sun was beginning to disappear behind the distant hills. A soft breeze moved across the fields, carrying the faint scent of evening fires from the village. Somewhere far away a small bell rang softly. Perhaps a farmer calling animals back to their barn, or a church bell marking the end of the working day. The sheep continued their slow walk along the familiar road. Many of them had travelled this path hundreds of times before. They knew the direction as well as the shepherd did. Still, a few curious lambs occasionally wandered toward the edges of the field. The sheepdog gently guided them back toward the centre of the group. The shepherd gave a quiet whistle, and the dog adjusted its path without hesitation. The two of them worked together with calm understanding. The valley below them slowly came to life as the flock approached the village. Farmers were finishing their work in the fields. Some gathered tools beside wooden fences. Others loaded carts with bundles of crops harvested during the day. A few farmers paused when they saw the flock approaching. They leaned on their fences and watched the peaceful line of sheep moving down the road. The shepherd lifted his hand in greeting. Many of these farmers were his neighbours. They had known each other for years, but words were rarely needed. A quiet nod was enough. The sky above continued changing colours. The bright blue of the afternoon had faded into deep orange and purple. Clouds drifted slowly across the horizon like soft brushstrokes painted across the evening sky. Birds flew low across the fields, searching for their nests before darkness settled over the land. The sheep moved steadily forward. Their hooves made soft sounds against the packed dirt road. Every now and then, one of them let out a quiet bleat. The sound echoed gently through the valley. The shepherd listened to these familiar sounds with calm patience. They were the music of his everyday life, simple, steady, and comforting. As the flock reached the lower fields near the village, the road became slightly wider. Small stone walls separated the farmers' fields from the path. The shepherd carefully guided the sheep along the centre of the road, so they would not wander into the crops. The sheepdog moved quickly along the edges, gently steering any sheep that drifted too close to the walls. The village houses were now clearly visible ahead. Small wooden huts with thatched roofs lined the narrow streets. Thin streams of smoke curled upward from their chimneys. Inside those homes, families were preparing their evening meals. The smell of cooking bread and stew drifted faintly through the air. A few villagers stood near their doors, watching the flock approach. Children sometimes gathered near the road, fascinated by the passing sheep. One small boy waved excitedly as the flock moved past him. The shepherd smiled and lifted his staff slightly in greeting. The sheep themselves paid little attention to the people around them. Their focus remained on the path ahead. The wooden sheep enclosure stood near the edge of the village, not far from the shepherd's small hut. The familiar fence came into view as the flock moved closer. The sheepdog moved ahead and stood near the gate, waiting for the shepherd's signal. The shepherd stepped forward and opened the wooden gate slowly. The sheep began entering the enclosure one by one. They moved calmly through the opening, filling the fenced area with quiet, rustling sounds. The dog stood watch near the entrance, ensuring that none of the sheep turned back toward the road. The shepherd counted them silently as they passed through the gate. Every sheep had to be accounted for. Losing even one animal could be a serious problem. Finally, the last sheep stepped inside the enclosure. The shepherd closed the wooden gate and secured it firmly. The flock settled quickly into the familiar space. Some sheep began lying down immediately. Others wandered slowly around the enclosure before resting beside the group. The sheepdog walked once around the fence before returning to the shepherd's side. The long journey back from the hills was complete. The sky above had now grown darker. The last golden light of the sun faded behind the distant hills. Small stars began appearing in the deepening blue sky. The shepherd leaned on his staff and looked across the quiet village. Another long day on the medieval hills had come to an end. The sheep were safe, the fields were quiet, and the peaceful night of the countryside was slowly beginning. The sky above the village slowly darkened as evening settled across the countryside. The last golden light of the sun had disappeared behind the distant hills. Now the sky glowed with soft shades of deep blue and purple. One by one, the first stars began appearing overhead. The shepherd stood quietly beside the wooden fence of the sheep enclosure. Inside the pen, the flock had already begun settling down for the night. Some sheep lay peacefully on the ground. Others stood close together, their thick wool protecting them from the cool evening air. The soft rustling of the animals filled the quiet space. Occasionally one of the sheep let out a low bleat before returning to its calm rest. The shepherd slowly walked along the fence, carefully checking each side of the enclosure. The wooden posts needed to remain strong. If a weak section of fence broke during the night, a sheep might wander away, or worse, a predator might find its way inside. The sheepdog followed closely beside him, sniffing along the ground near the fence. The dog's sharp senses often noticed things the shepherd might miss. After walking around the enclosure once, the shepherd felt satisfied that everything was secure. He leaned his wooden staff against the fence and looked across the quiet village. Small lanterns had begun glowing in the windows of the houses. Families inside were gathering around their evening meals. The smell of warm bread and stew drifted through the cool night air. Some villagers could be heard speaking softly as they walked along the narrow dirt road. Others were finishing their last chores before heading indoors. For most people in the village, the day was nearly finished, but the shepherd still had a few small tasks to complete. He opened a small wooden storage box beside the enclosure. Inside were sacks of dried hay and a bucket of water. While the sheep had spent most of the day grazing on the hills, it was still important to provide a little extra food and water for the night. The shepherd scattered a small bundle of hay near the centre of the enclosure. Several sheep slowly walked toward it and began eating. The rest of the flock remained calm and relaxed. They had already eaten well during the long hours on the hills. The sheepdog moved quietly among them for a moment, before returning to the shepherd's side. The shepherd gently patted the dog's head. "You've done well today," he said softly. The dog wagged its tail in quiet satisfaction. The bond between a shepherd and his dog was strong. Day after day they worked side by side, watching over the flock. Neither one could do the job alone. After finishing his tasks, the shepherd stepped away from the enclosure and walked toward his small hut. The wooden door creaked slightly as he pushed it open. Inside, the room was simple but comfortable. A small table stood near the centre of the room. A wooden stool rested beside it. Against one wall stood a narrow bed covered with a thick wool blanket. In the corner, a small stone fireplace held the glowing remains of last night's fire. The shepherd knelt beside the fireplace and added a few pieces of dry wood. Soon, a small flame flickered to life. Warm light filled the room, pushing back the darkness outside. The sheepdog settled down near the doorway, curling into a comfortable position on the floor. The shepherd sat at the table and opened a small cloth bundle containing his evening meal. Tonight it was simple: a small loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, and a cup of cool water. Meals like this were common for shepherds in the Middle Ages. Life on the hills was quiet and humble, but it was also peaceful. The shepherd ate slowly while listening to the sounds of the night outside. Crickets had begun their steady song in the grass. A gentle wind moved across the village rooftops. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked briefly before falling silent again. The shepherd finished his meal and leaned back slightly on the wooden stool. His body felt tired after the long day spent walking across the hills, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from honest work beneath the open sky. He stepped outside the hut once more and looked toward the sheep enclosure. The flock had grown very quiet now. Most of the animals were resting peacefully. The sheepdog remained beside the hut, watching calmly over the area. Above them, the night sky stretched endlessly across the countryside. Thousands of stars glittered like tiny lights scattered across the darkness. In a world without bright city lamps, the stars shone brilliantly above the medieval countryside. The shepherd looked up at them for a moment. Tomorrow would bring another long day on the hills, another sunrise, another quiet journey with the flock. But for now the village rested peacefully beneath the night sky, and the shepherd prepared to welcome the calm silence of the medieval night. The night had now fully settled over the small medieval village. The sky above was dark and wide, filled with countless shining stars. Without bright lanterns or city lights to dim their glow, the stars appeared incredibly clear. They stretched across the sky like a silent ocean of light. The shepherd stood quietly outside his small hut for a moment, looking upward. The cool night air brushed gently across the fields and rooftops of the village. A soft breeze moved through the grass beyond the wooden fences. From inside the sheep enclosure came the quiet sounds of the resting flock. Most of the sheep were now lying close together. Their thick wool coats protected them from the cold air of the night. Every now and then one of them shifted slightly, causing a gentle rustling sound to ripple through the group. The shepherd walked slowly toward the enclosure one more time. Even though he had already checked the fence earlier, a careful shepherd always looked once more before resting. The sheepdog followed close behind him. The dog's eyes reflected faintly in the starlight as it scanned the quiet fields. The shepherd rested his hands on the top of the wooden fence and looked inside. The flock appeared calm and peaceful. A few sheep lifted their heads briefly when they noticed him. Then they settled again, comforted by the familiar presence of their guardian. Beyond the enclosure, the countryside stretched into darkness. The hills that had been bright and green during the day were now only faint shadows against the horizon. The forest in the distance looked like a dark wall beneath the starry sky. The shepherd listened carefully to the sounds of the night. Crickets chirped softly in the grass. An owl called from somewhere beyond the village fields. The sound echoed briefly before fading into silence again. These night sounds were familiar to anyone who lived in the countryside during the Middle Ages. While the villagers slept, the natural world continued its quiet activities beneath the stars. The shepherd walked slowly back toward his hut. Inside, the small fire he had lit earlier continued to burn gently in the stone fireplace. Warm orange light flickered against the wooden walls of the room. The sheepdog stepped inside and curled up near the door once again. The shepherd closed the door behind him and added another small piece of wood to the fire. The flames brightened slightly, filling the hut with comfortable warmth. After a long day on the hills, the simple shelter felt welcoming. The shepherd removed his heavy wool cloak and hung it beside the bed. His boots were dusty from walking across the grassy slopes. He set them near the door before sitting down for a moment on the wooden stool. His body felt pleasantly tired. The long hours spent walking behind the flock, watching the hills, and guiding the animals home had used much of his strength. But this was the rhythm of his life, day after day, season after season. The shepherd stretched his arms slowly and looked around the quiet room. Everything inside the hut was simple: a table, a stool, a bed, a fireplace. Nothing more was needed for a life spent mostly outdoors. After a few moments he stood and stepped outside one last time before resting. The night air felt cooler now. The village had grown almost completely silent. Most of the lanterns inside the houses had been extinguished. Families were already asleep inside their homes. The shepherd walked to the enclosure gate and checked it once again. The wooden latch remained strong and secure. Inside, the sheep rested quietly. The sheepdog stood beside the shepherd for a moment, looking across the dark fields. The two of them had spent the entire day working together. Now the quiet night offered them both a well-earned rest. The shepherd gently patted the dog's head before turning back toward the hut. Inside, the fire continued glowing softly. He lay down on the narrow bed and pulled the thick wool blanket over himself. The warmth of the blanket and the gentle crackling of the fire quickly made the room feel calm and comfortable. Outside, the stars continued shining over the silent hills. The sheep rested safely within their enclosure. The village slept peacefully beneath the quiet sky, and the medieval shepherd slowly closed his eyes, letting the calm rhythm of the countryside carry him into a deep and restful sleep. Deep night covered the countryside. The village rested beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. Inside their small wooden homes, families slept peacefully after a long day of work. The narrow dirt roads between the houses were empty and still. Even the soft evening voices that had once drifted through the air had now faded into silence. Near the edge of the village, the shepherd's hut stood quietly beside the sheep enclosure. Inside the hut, the small fire in the stone fireplace had burned down to glowing embers. The room was dim, but still warm. The shepherd slept beneath his thick wool blanket. Years of working long days on the hills had taught his body to rest deeply during the night. Beside the door, the sheepdog lay curled on the floor. Even while resting, the dog's ears occasionally twitched at the smallest sounds from outside. A shepherd's dog never fully slept. It remained aware of the flock even during the quietest hours. Outside, the sheep enclosure remained calm. Most of the flock slept peacefully, gathered close together for warmth. Their breathing created a soft and steady rhythm in the cool night air. From time to time, a sheep shifted slightly in the grass. Another might quietly bleat before settling again beside the others. These small sounds were normal during the night. They were simply part of the life of the flock. Beyond the village, the countryside stretched silently beneath the moonlight. The hills that had been bright and green during the day now appeared as dark shapes against the horizon. The distant forest stood still beneath the sky. From deep within those woods came the occasional cry of a night animal. An owl glided silently above the fields, searching for movement in the grass below. Its wings made no sound as it passed over the sleeping village. The shepherd's dog lifted its head briefly when the owl called from the distance, but after listening for a moment the dog lowered its head again. There was no danger nearby. The sheep remained safe inside their wooden enclosure. The long, quiet hours of the night continued slowly. High above the countryside, the moon drifted across the sky. Its pale light touched the rooftops of the village houses. It also illuminated the wooden fence of the sheep enclosure. Inside the pen, the flock rested without disturbance. The medieval countryside often felt peaceful during these late hours, but it was also a time when the shepherd's watchfulness mattered most. If a predator ever approached the flock, it would likely happen during the darkness of night. That was why the strong wooden fence and the loyal sheepdog were so important. Together they protected the flock until morning arrived. Time passed quietly. The stars slowly shifted across the sky. The air grew slightly colder as the deepest part of the night approached. Inside the shepherd's hut, the last glowing embers of the fire faded gently. But the thick walls and warm blankets kept the room comfortable. The shepherd slept calmly, knowing his flock was secure. After many hours, the darkness slowly began to change. Far to the east, the first faint hint of pale light appeared along the horizon. It was very subtle at first, just a thin line of grey separating the earth from the sky. But it marked the quiet beginning of a new day. The birds would soon awaken, the farmers would soon rise from their beds, and the shepherd would once again step onto the hills with his flock. For now, though, the village remained asleep. The sheep rested peacefully inside their enclosure. The dog continued its quiet watch, and the medieval countryside waited patiently for the first light of dawn to return. The darkness of night slowly began to fade. Far beyond the eastern hills, the sky was changing. At first, the change was almost impossible to notice. The deep black of night softened into a quiet shade of grey. Then slowly, gently, a pale blue glow began spreading across the horizon. The long medieval night was ending. Inside the small shepherd's hut near the edge of the village, the air had grown cool. The fire in the stone hearth had burned down to a bed of quiet ash. But beneath his thick wool blanket, the shepherd slept comfortably after the long day spent on the hills. Outside, the countryside remained peaceful. The village streets were still empty. Most of the houses remained dark and silent. But the natural world was already beginning to stir. High in the branches of a nearby tree, a small bird gave the first quiet call of the morning. Another answered from somewhere across the fields. Soon the soft songs of several birds filled the air. It was the gentle music of dawn. The sheep inside the wooden enclosure began to move as well. A few animals slowly lifted their heads. Some stood up and stretched their legs after the long night of rest. Soft, bleating sounds drifted across the quiet yard. The sheepdog was the first to fully awaken. Its ears lifted as it listened to the sounds of the waking countryside. The dog stood slowly and walked toward the door of the shepherd's hut. After a moment it gave a small bark, not loud, just enough to signal that the new day had begun. Inside the hut the shepherd stirred beneath his blanket. Years of waking early had trained his body well. Even without the dog's call, he would have awakened soon. He sat up slowly and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. The first faint light of dawn filtered through the small window beside his bed. Another day on the hills was about to begin. The shepherd stood and stretched his arms. His muscles felt stiff after the long hours of walking the day before. But the fresh morning air that drifted through the hut quickly helped wake him fully. He placed another small piece of wood into the hearth and sparked a small flame to life. The fire crackled softly as it began warming the room again. After pulling on his boots and wool cloak, the shepherd stepped outside. The sky above the village was now painted with soft shades of pale blue and silver. The sun had not yet risen above the hills, but its light was already touching the clouds. The air felt cool and fresh. A thin mist drifted across the fields beyond the village. The shepherd walked toward the sheep enclosure. Inside the pen, the flock was fully awake now. Several sheep had gathered near the wooden gate, as if they already knew the morning journey would soon begin again. The shepherd rested his hands on the fence and looked across them carefully. Every sheep appeared healthy and calm. The long night had passed without trouble. The sheepdog stood beside him, its tail wagging slowly as it watched the flock. The shepherd opened the gate slightly and stepped inside the enclosure. He walked slowly through the group, quietly checking the animals. This simple routine was important. A shepherd always needed to notice if any sheep were injured or weak before leading them back to the hills. Today, everything looked good. The flock had rested well. The shepherd stepped back outside the enclosure and closed the gate once more. Soon it would be time to begin the day's journey. The hills beyond the village waited patiently. As the sky continued to brighten, the first rays of sunlight finally appeared above the distant horizon. Golden light spread slowly across the countryside. The rooftops of the village glowed softly in the early morning sun. Farmers were beginning to step outside their homes. A rooster crowed loudly somewhere near the village square. The shepherd took a deep breath of the cool morning air. Another day had arrived. Another quiet journey across the hills with the flock. For most people in the modern world, life moves quickly. Cities are filled with noise. Days pass in a blur of constant activity. But the life of a medieval shepherd followed a very different rhythm. A slower rhythm. A calmer rhythm. A life shaped by sunrise and sunset, by changing seasons, by the simple needs of the animals he protected. The shepherd lifted his wooden staff and gave a quiet whistle. The sheepdog moved instantly to its familiar position beside the flock. The wooden gate opened once again. One by one, the sheep began stepping out onto the narrow dirt path that led toward the hills, just as they had done yesterday, and the day before, and many days before that. The flock moved slowly along the road. The shepherd walked behind them with calm patience. The dog guided the edges of the group. The rising sun warmed the countryside. Mist lifted gently from the fields. Birds flew across the brightening sky. And the peaceful life of the medieval shepherd began once more. Day after day. Season after season. A quiet story repeated across the hills of the Middle Ages. A life of patience, of watchfulness, of simple work beneath the wide open sky. And somewhere beyond the green slopes ahead, another long and peaceful day waited for the shepherd and his flock.